Pet from hell. Boom! Thud came from the front of the car. In the headlight beams, I could see the body of a small animal was thrown to the roadside. I stepped on the gas. "What are you doing?" my wife asked. "Maybe we could still help that animal." "We aren't a charity. We have to be in Rodwell in the morning." "Michael, what's wrong with you? Why are you so cruel?" I bit my lips firmly and didn't answer her. For a moment she looked at me with startled and even offended eyes, and then fatigue overcame her and my wife once again fell into a slumber. I continued to drive through the night, but my thoughts returned to my childhood. Boom! Thud came from the front when our family station wagon knocked down some small animal. It was nighttime, and when my father had noticed the animal, it had been too late. He stopped the car and together with my mother went to check what had happened. The chrome bumper seemed intact, but the helpless little body was floundering on the roadside. "Stay," my father commanded after I had already gotten out of the car. At that time, I was 10 years old. "It seems severely injured. Most likely it'll die. We can't do anything," my father said to my mother. "But what is it, dear? I've never seen such an animal." "Don't know. Probably some calf. That's why we can't identify it." "Looks like a cat with a sharp nose, but those eyes." While they were talking, I came closer to the small body. When it noticed my presence, the animal stopped desperately floundering and whining. It was about the size of a kitten, but with a pointed dog-like muzzle and spiked ears. The fur was bright black. The small animal looked closely at me. Its red eyes shone brightly in the dark, like if they were lit. I'd never seen any other animal like that, not before and not after. "Help me. Save me. You can do it. I know. You need me. You love me." Some voice was talking in my head. I stretched my hand and petted the small animal. Its fur was very soft and fluffy. The animal began to flounder and whine again. The strange voice disappeared from my head. "Son, I told you to stay in the car. It's time for us to go. Leave that animal." However, I didn't want to leave the little animal, no matter what. I took it in my hands and started to cry as loud as I could. I was whining until my parents allowed me to keep the animal. In the car, I didn't let it out of my hands. I was sitting in the car with eyes closed and almost had fallen asleep when I heard my father quietly say, "Let's wait a little bit more for Mike to fall asleep completely, and then we'll throw it out." I opened my eyes and kept them open until the end of the journey. That time, our family was going on a summer holiday to my grandparents' house. This house was located in a small, picturesque countryside town. My grandparents bred chickens. Immediately after arrival, I asked my grandmother for milk to feed my little animal. As a miracle, it was drinking milk with great pleasure. I begged my father for allowance to keep the small creature. In the end, I convinced him the animal had the chance of survival, and he allowed me to keep it. I can't remember any more when I've been so tired in my life as that day, but we both, my pet and I, were sleeping all day. It had curled in a carton box provided by my grandfather. I hadn't slept all night while we had been driving in my father's car. A week went by and my pet was still alive. It had survived a collision with my father's car. I called it Roger, and Roger loved to drink milk every day. We showed Roger to many people, but nobody knew what animal it was. Roger refused other food and continued to drink only milk. Unfortunately, it turned out that Roger was a night animal and it became active only towards the evening, so I couldn't play with it during the day. It spent days in the carton box beside my bed. And then, strange things started to happen. I woke up at 7 in the morning. At first, I couldn't understand why I was awake so fast, and then I realized that my grandmother was discussing something loudly in the hallway with my father and some strangers. I opened the door ajar to hear better what had happened. "I've never seen anything like that before," I heard my grandmother say. "Madam, please calm down. It's probably just a stray dog." an unfamiliar voice answered. That's not a dog. A dog tears apart its victims instead of sucking them dry. Let's bring the dead hens to the veterinarian. Maybe he'll be able to tell us what killed them, my father said. Later, I had learned that 2 chickens had been killed on that night. It was strange that it turned out blood had been sucked out of the chickens instead of lacerating them. After finding the dead chickens, my grandparents immediately had contacted the Animal Control Service. The employees of the Animal Control Service had been those strangers which I heard in the morning. Summer was in its bloom, and I continued to live my usual summer holiday life. To be honest, the attacks on the chickens weren't particularly disturbing to me. After some time, 5 more chickens were killed the same way, but the only thing I worried about during these events was that my grandma no longer smiled and laughed as often as before. Roger also seemed to feel great. It had grown fast and had reached the size of an adult cat. The animal continued to sleep during the days, curled in its box, but during the nights it went on its business. In the summer I left the window open. The nights were warm. After the death of the 6th chicken, an alarming thought came into my mind. Maybe Roger was somehow associated with the mysterious deaths of the chickens. After all, the animal began to grow rapidly after the chickens had started to die. I looked at the animal, which was peacefully sleeping in its carton box. It couldn't be true. Another oddity of Roger was that it didn't have teeth. Perhaps this was the reason the animal only drank milk. I had to give Roger today's milk. At the beginning, Roger had dried the plate every night, but more recently, the milk was often left untouched. I furrowed my brow. Today, too, Roger hadn't drunk the milk. I woke up in the middle of the night. Usually I didn't need to go to the toilet at night, but the previous evening I'd drunk a lot of fresh juice, so this time I had to go. I stepped out of the bed and got into the hallway. The house at night seemed mysterious and eerie. Old floorboards squeaked when I stepped on particular places, but no other sound could be heard. In the living room, long shadows were waving on the floor. They were cast by garden bushes. Further in the garden, the hen house was visible. The building was dark and seemed to foreshadow something evil. Grandma had tried to board up all the barn slots to make it impossible for a predator to get inside, and the barn door was tightly locked. I shook my head. After all, I was 10 years old. I slept in my own room for a long time now and didn't believe in the boogeyman. After visiting the toilet, I walked into the hallway again. Then I heard a silent meow. At first, I thought that it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again. It seemed to me that the sound came from the garden. I went into the living room and looked out of the window. Then I noticed 2 shadows of small animals in the bushes. I decided to go out and see what was going on there. These animals were smaller than dogs and didn't seem to cause any threat to me. I walked quietly. The animals noticed my presence only when I was pretty close already. From this distance, I realized that one of the animals was my Roger. I immediately recognized it from the bright red eyes that glowed in the night like lit candles. Roger was seizing in its mouth some other animal, which seemed to be the neighbor's cat. "Roger, what are you doing?" I said out loud. And then I finally got to know what kind of animal Roger really was. Roger turned to me, still clutching the helpless cat in its mouth. At that moment, the cat lost all signs of life. My pet released the cat's neck, and then I saw Roger's teeth for the first time. About 4-inch-long fangs, sharp like needles, were pulled out of the cat's body. Compared to the rest of the animal's body, they seemed huge. When the fangs were pulled out, they folded into Roger's muzzle. Probably that was the reason why Roger's muzzle was so long. "Hello, Master. So, you finally caught me. But you love me. You love me more than anything else in this world. So, you won't tell anyone about this. Now you'll go to have sweet dreams." The same voice that had been there when I first saw the little animal on the roadside was talking in my head again. I was staring into Roger's bright red eyes. I'd fallen into a state similar to a trance. Then I turned around and went back. I don't know if I was able to really hear it or it was only sounding in my head, but I clearly understood that the fangs had been pierced into the helpless cat's body again, and the suction had resumed. How I managed to get to my room, I no longer remember. The next thing that comes to memory is the morning. In the morning, our neighbor was yelling in a shrilling voice. Everyone had run out into the garden. I was also rushing through the hallway. The closer I was approaching the door, the faster my heart was beating. When I just woke up, everything that had happened at night seemed like just an evil nightmare. For a brief moment, I really had believed that the night's events were just some bad dream. But now, as I stood at the door, my belief was dissipating in the air. The cat's body was laying in the exact same spot where the night's events had taken place. The neighbor had climbed over our hedge, scratching her arms against sharp twigs. She was mumbling and moaning helplessly. Father was contemplating something while scrutinizing the cat, but my mother was trying to calm down the desperate woman. My grandparents had rushed to check on their chickens. I could read in my father's face that none of them understood what really had happened here. Only I knew the truth. I opened my mouth to say something, but immediately closed it. Some mystical and overwhelming force was holding my mouth shut. And I suddenly fell into a trance state like last night. I didn't say anything to my parents. The day passed by like a nightmare. I almost didn't speak at all and spent the whole day in the garden. But I wasn't playing there. I was just sitting on the bench. I'd been sitting in the sun for too long, so I was sweating heavily. I was scared to go inside the house. Beside my bed, a little Satan was sleeping. "Oh God, Michael!" My mother touched my forehead in the evening. "You have a fever, so that's why you've been behaving so strangely." My parents took me to the room and stuffed me with medicine. Probably Satan himself was sleeping beside my bed, but I couldn't object to anything. I was so emaciated that, despite the fear, I fell asleep. I woke up at night. My head was a little clearer. Different thoughts ran through it about what to do now. I was scared to look over the bed's edge to make sure that Roger wasn't in his box. I knew that the creature probably was seeking its next victim right then. But what would happen if it were in its box and looked at me with those hellish red eyes? Finally, I collected all my courage and peered over the edge. Roger wasn't there. Then the thought came into my mind that I should get rid of the animal's box. If it doesn't have a place to sleep, maybe the little bastard won't return anymore. I got out of bed and took the box with me. Then I walked into the hallway and stood there for a while. How exactly should I get rid of it? I could safely throw it in the trash, but it seemed to me that it would be much more satisfactory to burn it. I went to the kitchen and tried to find matches, but unsuccessfully. My grandma kept them in a cupboard that was beyond my reach. Then I remembered that my father kept the lighter beside his bed on the night shelf. It was always next to him. He used to say that a man without fire isn't a man. I went into my parents' room. Both parents were sleeping, and I was trying to remember which boards in this room creaked and which ones were safe. Finally, the lighter was in my hand. Its glossy metal body was noticeable even in the dark. After that, when I'd almost left the room, last night's strange feeling came back. I could sense the horrendous suction in the darkness. Fear welled in my throat. I quickly turned around and studied both sleeping parents. Nothing suspicious was noticeable. The blanket was slowly waving in the rhythm of their breath. But still, something was very wrong here. I felt it with my whole being. My eyes were scrutinizing the room. The window was left open. Very bad. I continued to study the room until my gaze stopped at my little sister's bed. She was 1 year old at the time. Behind the crib's bars, I noticed a dark shadow, its shape clearly outlined on the background of my little sister's white clothes. Unfortunately, for me, the creature also had noticed me and was looking at me through the crib's bars, its red eyes hellishly glowing in the dark. "Hello again, Master. Were you longing for me? Were you waiting for our meeting? You love me. You know that. You love me more than anything in the world. You love me even more than your little sister. Go to sleep now. You won't tell anything to anyone in the morning. Go now." The voice was talking in my head again, and my heart seemed to stop for a moment. But then some resisting force emerged from the depth of my soul. No, 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 I was screaming inside. I didn't go away, and I tried to utter some sound to wake my parents. My mouth refused to obey. I turned away from the little bastard with red eyes. As soon as I did that, I felt the strength in my body, but my mouth still defied me. I needed to do something right away. I began to walk to my parents' bed to wake them. A silent thud sounded on the floor. Roger had jumped out of my sister's bed. Immediately afterward, its red eyes were glowing before me in the dark. I hadn't reached my parents' bed. In my head, an outrageous voice started to talk again. Master, you're a real traitor. Traitors have to pay for their sins. Traitors are disgusting cowards. But you know that, don't you? You can't be my master anymore, so you have to obey me now. You have to fulfill your last task. The creature was approaching me. The box I had been holding all the time slipped out of my hand and fell on the floor. Unfortunately, my parents didn't wake up from this sound. I stepped back, but stumbled over the box and fell beside it. Why don't they wake up when you need it? But when you don't, they hear every noise, I thought to myself. In the next moment, I sensed the creature was already on my chest. Its eyes, now only a few inches from my face, were watching me closely. It seemed that they were piercing my soul. My head was empty. Suddenly, there were no thoughts, no mystical voices, no fear, and no hope. There was only an endless void. The last thought that occurred to me was that this is probably how humans feel before they die. Lack of thoughts completely paralyzed my body. Although the bastard was only a small animal, due to the state of my mind, I was completely powerless against it. At the next moment, I felt its fangs pierce into my skin on my neck, but I didn't feel pain. This state of hypnosis probably served also as an anesthetic. The creature began to suck my blood like an enormous mosquito. After tasting the fresh blood, the creature reduced its telepathic effect. I realized that I could move my hand a bit. This was the pest's fateful mistake. It probably hadn't had such a big victim as me before. I sensed that I was still clenching my father's lighter in my hand. It was the old school roller and flint type one. I had been playing with it without permission before, and usually I hadn't been able to light it up right away. I had to try several times before it had finally lighted up. But this time, the first try had to be successful. I wouldn't have the strength to try again, and the creature would probably take action after my first unsuccessful attempt. I collected all my remaining strength and stroked the lighter. A spark ignited the gas which was flowing out of the reservoir. The lighter lighted up. I was frantically pressing my thumb onto the gas button and started to burn the bastard's left haunch. At first, probably from the ecstasy caused by fresh blood, the creature didn't notice anything, but when the burnt fur smell began to appear, I felt the suction stop. The hypnosis also ceased. Little bastard drew its fangs out of my neck. This caused me a lot of pain due to the lack of the anesthetic hypnosis. At last, fully sensing the pain caused by the burn, the creature uttered a heartbreaking, screeching cry. Almost at the same time, I started to cry too. I was weeping as loud as I could. My parents woke up immediately, but before they turned on the light, the creature had already left the room. Its black shadow disappeared behind the door jamb, and it was the last time I ever saw it. I'll never forget the look on their faces when they saw me that night. Expressions of absolute horror, fear, and incomprehension. But what else could they feel? That night they found their 10-year-old son in their bedroom on the floor with a bleeding neck, crying and weeping frantically. Yes, at that moment, I didn't need a long time to reach the maximum amount of tears and snot. After this event, our family rushed back to the city. My little sister and I were both hospitalized. My little sister almost didn't make it. We were diagnosed with severe anemia. After that, we didn't go to our countryside home for the summer holidays anymore. Still, long after these events, I talked about Roger with my father, but he didn't believe me, or at least pretended not to believe me. When I was already a teenager, he said it was just an evil nightmare caused by illness. However, in adolescence, I already knew people well enough to read on my father's face that he wasn't so unbelieving after all. Dark shadows always swept over his face when I brought up this topic. Evidence had been obvious when it all had happened. My sister and I still have the scars left by the creature's fangs. I returned to the present. The sun began to dawn behind the horizon. The engine was quietly roaring, and we were only half an hour away from Rodwell. Morning brings a sense of safety. It washes away the night's nightmares, makes them unbelievable and far. But I know very well that somewhere in the night it is still roaming, a pet from hell.